"I'm gonna go for a walk." It was business as usual that day. The cloud-covered sky promised rain, but it was still stiflingly hot. The streets seemed familiar, as if eternity had not had time to darken this corner of the city. Passers-by went about their business. Cars rolled slowly along the road, paying no attention to those who walked on the sidewalks. Everything was in its own order. But he didn't know that this day would not be like any other. He didn't know that today would turn his life upside down forever. The young man, still in pain from his fresh injury, moved forward cautiously, leaning on his crutches. Each step was agony for him, but he gritted his teeth and kept walking. He was alone, only his own thoughts and the noise of the street preventing him from concentrating. He was unprepared for what awaited him. He didn't know that a nightmare awaited him around the corner. The teenager with the crutches attracted attention. Not because he was conspicuous, but because you don't often get people like him in this neighborhood. He was different, and not just because of his injury. He was black, and in this town, that meant more than just skin color. It meant you could be looked at differently, treated differently. No one talked to him, no one offered to help him. He was just one of many passing by. But his life was about something else. It was about overcoming pain and moving forward. The streets were filled with an increasingly unsettling silence that became more palpable with each step. Something was wrong. Something hung in the air like a heavy cloud, ready to break at any moment. His crutches creaked on the asphalt, and his heart in his chest began to beat faster, for no apparent reason. He stopped for a few seconds, looking over his shoulder, but he didn't notice anything. Still, the same people, the same cars, the same noise. And then, as if in answer to his premonitions, he heard the sound of sirens, barely audible at first, but rapidly approaching. He paid no attention to it. There was no sign of trouble, but suddenly, at a bend, a police car came around the corner. He felt his heart beat even faster. A moment later, his gaze met the eyes of one of the policemen sitting in the car. There was nothing but a stern emptiness in his eyes. It was a strange, vague feeling. He didn't even have time to think about what it might mean. The policeman held his gaze on him. The young man took a step aside to give way, but suddenly, as if on cue, the car stopped right in front of him. Two officers jumped out of the car with clear intent. One was younger, clearly new to the force. The other was more experienced. He looked at the teenager and froze. And then it happened. There was not the slightest confusion with his movements. He approached quickly and roughly, given no time to react. "Freeze!" he shouted. The teenager's hands froze in midair. His crutches creaked helplessly, but he couldn't move. There was already a tension in the air, in the atmosphere, that was impossible to ignore. Something in that look, something in his gesture was wrong. The policeman didn't see the man in front of him as a man suffering, a man with a disability. He saw a threat. The young guy was just too quiet, too off to be safe. And at that moment, without any warning, the cop pulled out a taser. The young man felt the blood freeze in his veins as the stun gun pierced his body. With a bolt of lightning, it was as if the whole world disappeared. His body was paralyzed, every nerve impulse, every cell screaming, but there was no sound. He collapsed to the ground. Pain, as if leaving him no room to breathe, filled the entire space until the world disappeared behind a white shroud of pain. He didn't understand what was happening. He couldn't understand why this was happening to him. Everything happened too fast. In an instant, his life was changed forever. This neighborhood has always been under the watchful eye of the police. They said that crime was on the rise, that drugs were being sold in every alleyway, that a threat could be waiting around any corner. Of course, none of them could say exactly who that threat was, but they had long ago formed an image in their minds. Young, black, sloppily dressed, too slow or, on the contrary, too fast, with his hands in his pockets or empty, it didn't matter. The main thing was that he was a danger. Sergeant Williams believed in this image. He was the kind of seasoned officer who had worked the streets for years and learned to see problems right away. And today, he saw just such a problem. This teenager, he moved differently than everyone else. Something about his gait was annoying. The way he took his time, the way he shifted his feet slowly, like he didn't want to go where he was going. His skinny fingers clutched his crutches, and even that made him angry. Who was he to be weak? Who was he to look like he was owed something? "Hey, you, stop!" William's voice sounded harsh, commanding, but the boy didn't react immediately. He raised his head slowly, his eyes met those of the policeman, and in that instant irritation flared in the sergeant. That look, no fear, no pleading, no admission of guilt. "Are you deaf? I said stop." The boy froze. There was no surprise on his face, just cold, tired incomprehension. He obviously didn't know what he'd done wrong. "What are you doing here?" Williams stepped closer, while his partner, young Officer Rogers, stayed behind, clearly nervous. "Going home." The teenager's voice was quiet but firm. "Home?" Williams smirked, looking him over from head to toe. "Really? Home? Would anyone believe you?" The boy frowned. He still didn't understand what they wanted him to do. "I didn't do anything," he said calmly. "I haven't yet," the policeman interrupted him sharply. The teenager clutched his crutches, and for some reason that only made the sergeant angrier. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't begging. "Show me your pockets," Williams ordered. "I don't have any pockets." The guy backed up a little, but immediately felt the strong hand of the policeman pushing him forward. "You twitching means you're hiding something, right? Maybe drugs? Maybe a knife?" "I don't have anything." The teenager raised his voice, but it only made things worse. "Are you talking to me?" Williams took a step closer, hovering over him. He hated that voice already. Clear, confident, too smooth for someone who should be afraid. The boy pressed his back against the wall. He didn't understand why this was happening, but he knew he couldn't resist. Not in this town, not with his skin color. But it was too late. "Freak," Williams hissed, pulling out a taser. "What do you think you are?" Young Officer Rogers tensed for a moment. He could see that the boy in front of them was just a boy, that he posed no threat. But to say something? Go against the sergeant? It wasn't something he was capable of. "Wait, maybe don't," he muttered, but Williams had already pressed the button. The teen felt an electric shock pierce his body. It was not pain. It was something more terrible. It was humiliation, violence, destroying not only his body but his soul as well. He jerked, wheezed, his muscles stiffened, the fingers of the crutches loosened, and he collapsed to the ground, feeling the hard concrete digging into his skin. He heard laughter. "That's better," Williams said, putting away the taser. And that's it. It was nothing to him. For a teenager, it was a moment that would change his life forever. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether you or someone you know has had similar situations in their lives. How often do you think this happens in reality? Your opinions are very important. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. We continue. When the pain of the discharge subsided, he felt cold. The asphalt was hard, dirty, smelling of gasoline and sweat. Lying on the ground, he was breathing heavily, his body shaken from the residual spasms caused by the stun gun. He didn't know how much time had passed, maybe seconds, maybe forever. "Get up," he heard Officer Williams' voice. He tried to move, but his muscles still wouldn't obey him. His fingers trembled as if he'd just spent hours in ice water. I said, "Get up." A rough hand grabbed his shoulder and yanked him upward. The boy groaned. The pain in his leg pierced his body like a knife, but no one was going to feel sorry for him. "What are you, a cripple, huh?" The policeman grinned. The guy tried to grab the crutches that were lying nearby, but the officer easily knocked one of them aside with his foot. "Pick it up yourself." The guy froze. He couldn't. His leg throbbed with pain. His arms had yet to regain strength from the discharge. He couldn't just bend over and pick up the crutch, but the officer waited, waiting for him to get out of it, waiting for him to grovel. "What are you waiting for? Come on, pick it up." The grin in William's voice was thick as poison. The boy clenched his teeth. He made an attempt, leaned on one leg, and reached for the crutch. The world shook before his eyes, but he couldn't let himself fall again. "Long," Williams said sharply, and sharply kicked the crutch further. The guy froze. My throat was dry. His ears were noisy. He turned his head slowly and looked into the policeman's eyes. "You did it on purpose, didn't you?" His voice was husky but firm. "Wow, he's smart," laughed the officer. "Of course, on purpose. You don't know how to move fast, do you? And we've got a scary criminal here, so come on, show us how you move." He took a step closer, looming over him. "Get up. Now, no crutches." The boy clenched his fists. "I can't." The officer leaned even lower. "You don't want to. It's different." "I can't," shouted the teenager, for the first time not hiding his rage. "Yeah, so you're snapping at me too?" William's cold voice cut into my skin. The officer slowly unholstered the holster, placing his hand on the gun. "Maybe I can help you understand what real fear is." The guy froze. Time has stopped. They stood on a deserted street where everything went according to a script that had been followed thousands of times before. The guy is black, helpless, guilty by default. The officer is white, strong, the master of the situation. "I'll give you 3 seconds to get up, or I'll do it another way." "Yeah, I can't." 1. Somewhere in the distance, someone shouted. Some of the passers-by saw what was happening, but no one approached. 2. 1,000 thoughts raced through the boy's mind. He remembered his father's lessons. If a cop stops you, don't snap, don't move sharply, don't fight back, don't make eye contact for too long. He remembered all the stories he'd heard about the boy who'd been shot because he'd reached for his phone. The man who'd been strangled right on the street because he couldn't breathe. 3. He closed his eyes. I was expecting a hit, expecting a discharge, expecting a gunshot. But at that moment, a loud voice rang out. "What the hell are you doing?" The whole scene froze. The officer, the boy, the crowd that began to gather around. The scream sounded like a thunderous roar, and when he looked up, he saw a woman and realized that this hell was just beginning. "What the hell are you doing?" The woman's voice split the street like lightning. The crowd, previously silent, now moved, tension vibrating in the air. Policeman Williams turned toward the source of the scream and saw her. Tall, confident, with a hard stare. Her dark skin contrasted with her impeccably pressed business suit, and there was something about her that would make anyone freeze in place. But not him. His irritation only increased. "You'd better not interfere, ma'am." His voice was icy. "Stay out of it?" The woman stepped closer. Her eyes swept over the teenager, who was still struggling for balance, his breathing ragged, his face contorted with pain. "Do you realize what you're doing?" "I'm doing my job," Williams hissed. "This unsub is acting suspiciously." "This child is on crutches," she emphasized every word. "He's resisting arrest." The woman took another step forward, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you arresting him for?" Williams didn't like being questioned, especially someone like her. He felt his irritation turn to rage. "He disobeyed orders," he said. "Orders?" There was a distinct steel in her voice. "What kind of order? To stand up unassisted? To run on a broken leg?" The crowd around them was no longer just watching. They were waiting. They saw that this woman was not afraid. They saw that something was changing, and that made Williams even angrier. "If he can't get up," he said slowly with pressure, "that's his problem." He snatched up a taser. The woman took a sharp step forward, but it was too late. A jolt of electricity pierced the teenager. He jerked, muscles twisting, mouth open in a silent scream. He didn't fall immediately. His body froze in an unnatural pose for a moment before collapsing to the ground. He didn't yell. He was just lying there. "No!" The woman snapped out of her seat, but Officer Rogers, still silent, instinctively stepped forward, blocking her path. "Are you crazy?" Her voice was like a whiplash. "He's a child. He can't even move." Wouldn't have fought back and everything would have been fine. Williams replied coldly, holstering his taser. The boy, lying on the pavement, did not move. His chest heaved convulsively, but his arms remained lifelessly spread out on the dirty concrete. He felt tears streaming down his face, but he couldn't wipe them away. He couldn't move. There wasn't an ounce of regret in Williams's eyes. Not a single one. He saw a threat. He didn't see a boy. He saw a problem. And the problem was solved. The woman in the suit froze, but her eyes no longer expressed anger. They were expressing hatred. She slowly turned her head toward Officer Rogers, who was still standing in front of her, and spoke quietly but clearly. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Rogers swallowed the lump in his throat. Something in that voice made his heart clench. He didn't know who she was, but he'll find out soon enough. Very soon. The world around him was slowly disappearing. He heard sounds, distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. Someone was yelling. Someone was cursing. Someone's heavy footsteps thudded on the pavement. But none of that mattered. My body was numb. My muscles were still twitching from the residual current, but there was no strength even to move my fingers. His chest heaved sparsely with painful jerks. He could feel the warm wetness spreading under his cheek, blood oozing from the lip he'd bitten down on when he'd been knocked to the ground. But he couldn't wipe it off. He couldn't do anything. "Pick it up." The voice was familiar. It was him. Policeman. Someone who didn't see the teenager in front of him, didn't see the person, didn't see the pain, only the threat. Someone who's already made up his mind. This guy's not a victim. This guy's the problem. Hands grabbed him sharply by the shoulders and jerked him to his feet. The world spun before his eyes. He felt someone's fingers on his forearm, digging painfully into his skin, and heard a hoarse laugh. "So, it's a little tough without crutches, huh?" The boy didn't answer. He couldn't answer. His legs trembled beneath him, buckling. The pain in his broken leg was so acute that he felt as if he would pass out. But he didn't fall, because he was being held, because this white man in uniform decided he wasn't going to go down until he was allowed to. "Look at me," the policeman suddenly ordered. The boy slowly raised his head. Williams was in front of him, his lips curled in a grin. "Now, do you realize who's in charge here?" The voice was low, muffled, full of confidence. He wasn't afraid. He was never afraid, because the world was on his side. The teenager was silent. He couldn't speak. He felt his head fall forward. His body no longer held his balance, and after a moment he collapsed to the ground again. He heard laughter. "Well, enough of the spectacle, huh?" The policeman's voice sounded like he was talking to a pile of garbage, not a living person. "Or do you want to do it again?" Taser clicked in front of his eyes. The guy didn't move. Williams sighed, leaning lower. "You're not special." The words sounded like nails being hammered into concrete. "You're nobody. You're just like the rest of them. Always getting in where you don't belong. And you always end up like this." The teenager bit his lip. He wouldn't let himself cry. He wasn't supposed to cry. But inside, something was shrinking, breaking, burning to ashes. He was being broken. Slow, methodical, brutal. They weren't just taking away his freedom of movement. They were taking him away from himself. "You're just a black boy on crutches. You're weak. You're a nobody." Those words were seared into my consciousness, flowing through my veins along with the pain. But somewhere inside, something was still burning, barely audible, almost imperceptible, a smoldering coal, and until that coal was extinguished, he was still alive. She hadn't expected to see him here. As the woman walked down the narrow alleyway between the skyscrapers, where darkness was already beginning to thicken, she could not have known that for a few seconds the world around her would change. She was simply walking towards her son. But as she approached the corner, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The noise, screams, and the barely audible sound of falling. Her heart jumped when she saw him. His body. His defenseless body. The boy, her son, was lying on the pavement, under the steel heel of all their stereotypes and hatred. And standing next to him were these two policemen, one with a look of triumph, the other squinting nervously, as if he had just witnessed something he himself could not stop. The teenager lay breathing heavily, and his legs, which he had so often leaned on, were now unable to support him. The crutches lay to the side like discarded pieces of metal. He couldn't even stand up. The anger that bubbled up inside her was unbearable. It was her son. She clutched at her leather purse as she took a step forward, her eyes blazing with rage and the fear that now overwhelmed her. "Hey!" Her voice cut through the silence like a knife, but the police officers didn't immediately react. It was an underestimation of what might happen at that moment. She was a woman in a suit, but in that moment she was so much more. She was a mother. Policeman Williams, whose gaze was already so drunk with lust for power that he didn't notice who was in front of him, only grinned evilly at the sight of the woman who dared to interfere. "What do you want?" His voice was discreetly arrogant. The woman took a step, and her shoes scraping desperately on the pavement only emphasized her determination. But her voice was quieter when she spoke. "That's my son." Williams didn't immediately realize what she had said. Somehow, he hadn't expected this man to be associated with a teenager. And when it dawned on him that it was the judge, his face paled slightly. but only for a second. He quickly hid it behind a mask of contempt. Your son. His mockery was sharper than before. That's nice. She couldn't believe this was happening. Her anger, which had seemed controlled before, exploded. Who the hell are you to treat my son like this? The tone was venomous, and her eyes burned. She was no longer in control of her voice. It was getting louder and louder, with each word working its way into a heart that could take no more. Williams only snorted. His hateful gaze shifted from her to the boy, who, as before, couldn't get up. "Can't he get up?" he said contemptuously. "Maybe it's his own fault for being in this situation, too." The woman felt her heart clench, blood rushing through her veins. She knew this wasn't just a criminal injustice, it was a judgment. Judgment, in its worst form, but not for her, for her son. She couldn't understand how anyone could ever treat a person like that, how you could just decide their fate. She stepped closer, standing a step away from the policeman, his figure seeming almost repulsive to her now. "You don't realize who you're dealing with." Her voice was as cold as ice. Her words, like a hammer blow, silenced him for a few seconds. "I am a judge, and if you don't take your hands off my son, I guarantee you won't spend a day on duty." Wasn't that moment fateful? Moments when everything starts to come crashing down and you are powerless to stop what is inevitable. But Williams wasn't ready to give up. He was ready for resistance. Resistance from these men who too often looked for strength where there shouldn't be any. And in that moment, as her words exploded into the air, she looked into the officer's eyes and saw weakness in them. Let's take one more short pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you have had an incident in your life that resembles what is happening in this story. We care to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. The judge stood back, her gaze sliding across the dark asphalt where her son, her boy, continued to suffer. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every moment that stretched on into infinity made her blood boil with rage and pain. But despite her status, despite who she was in this world, she could feel her strength leaving her. She could do nothing to stop what was happening before her eyes. Her son, helpless, immobile, with a swollen face that couldn't hide the fear and pain, and the two policemen, one defiant, the other depressed, but both guilty of what was happening. They seemed absolutely calm, absolutely certain that no one would dare to stand up against them. After all, in their world, they were always right. The woman felt the ground slipping from under her feet. The law, what she lived by, what she protected, what she used to influence the lives of others, now seemed nothing more than an illusion. She was a lawmaker, but in front of these people, her power meant nothing. She was just a woman who stood by and watched her child being humiliated, mutilated, and there was no power to stop her. Policeman Williams turned slowly toward her, and his gaze was as contemptuous as ever. He knew she was a judge, but he also knew that her authority in this moment was helpless. To him, to his colleague, she was nothing more than a mere woman, someone who had no right to interfere in their case, even if her own child was the victim of this abuse. "Do you think you'll make a difference?" Williams asked with a smirk, not hiding his superiority. "You're nothing here. The law doesn't apply here. You can go if you don't want your son to get hurt more." Her heart clenched. These words, which were not just cruelty to her, but pure and unadulterated humiliation, sounded like a sentence. She tried to speak, tried to find the words to somehow stop this nightmare, but instead all she could do was remain silent. Silence like her son lying at the feet of a policeman. Silent like someone who couldn't fight because he had no power. She couldn't help but see how her status, her knowledge, her years of work, all these attributes that had once given her power and confidence, now seemed empty. In this moment, they meant nothing. She was only a witness whose word had no meaning, whose efforts vanished into the void. All of this was happening because there was someone who had decided that she didn't belong in this game, that she didn't belong around this teenager, this black boy who, in their opinion, deserved only punishment. She looked at the policeman, and her eyes met his. For a moment, it wasn't just a look. It was a burning pain reflected in her eyes. It wasn't just pain for her son, for what he was experiencing. It was the pain of her silence, her inability to fight in that moment. Her son lay there, and she stood and felt the law go silent. "What do you think, Judge?" Williams looked at her again with contempt. His words were full of contempt, but she noticed how he tried to hide his nervousness. He was confident of his victory, but there was something new in his eyes, something that made her heart clench. He was afraid of her, afraid of what her status and her name might bring about. He was afraid that this moment would have consequences, but he couldn't admit it. He only grew stronger in his certainty that she would remain silent. He turned to his partner, Rogers, and nodded. They both walked toward the car with a kind of strange grace, as if they were not human beings but mere wheels in a great mechanism, oblivious to its presence. It was all too good for them to stop, but the judge couldn't leave it like that. She took a step forward, clenched her fists. "It won't end this way," she said quietly, but her words carried a power she'd lacked before. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. She knew that this situation would not go without consequences. She knew she wouldn't let them get away with it. She was a mother. She was a judge. And in this moment, despite her powerlessness, she knew she would not let them win. The judge stood as if paralyzed as the officers left. Everything around her seemed frozen, and every sound became somehow distorted and alien. Her son was still lying on the pavement, his entire body pierced with pain, and on his face, despite his attempts to hide his suffering, was written only one thought: "You are not needed." In the moment in which she was forced to stay, every word, every thought seemed useless. There was nothing she could do to change anything. She was just a witness, nothing more. But suddenly, just as she was about to approach her son, just as her mother's instincts were calling out to her to help him up, it hit her. It was like a bolt of lightning. The policeman didn't know who he was dealing with. Her breath hitched. She realized instantly that these two, didn't understand. Didn't know that she was more than just a woman, more than just a witness. She was a judge whose word can destroy a man's life, whose word will decide the fate of every policeman who will ever fall under her justice. The same cop who had just used a taser on her son, he may not have known that she was the one who could destroy his career in the blink of an eye. He may not have even realized that his and his partner's fate was in her hands, and she had made her decision long ago. That moment was the decisive one, and a realization flashed through her mind. This situation was the harbinger of the end, but it wasn't so easy to stop. Everything that had happened was imprinted on her mind like an unbearable wound that was just beginning to bleed. She kept looking at them, despite the humiliation, despite the fact that they had unleashed their cruelty on her son, and suddenly she felt a rage that had no bounds. These policemen, they were sure that everything would stay that way. that they would remain untouchable. She knew she had to keep quiet. She couldn't make any rash moves. Too much was at stake. She couldn't allow herself to intervene in that moment. But now that the realization had penetrated deeply into her soul, she felt everything tearing from the inside out. Her entire life, her entire career, her entire commitment to the law was chained to that moment. Judge, mother, woman, it all blended into one. She couldn't just leave it all behind. She knew she had to do something, but she had to do it with cold determination. The policeman, the same Williams, felt his confidence begin to crack. His gaze, when he looked at her again, became a little nervous. He might still not have realized it, but something in his body told him he was wrong. His actions, they were wild. But now, looking at this woman, he suddenly realized she wasn't just a judge. He could feel the tension. It was as if every cell in her body was screaming that this moment would change everything, that her word carried weight, and that he might have just destroyed his career. But he was too proud and too determined to admit it right away. "Are you sure you know who I am?" she said quietly, but in a way that made his heart skip a beat. His gaze clouded over. He couldn't understand why she was speaking so calmly. He couldn't understand why his confidence, his complete authority in this moment was suddenly gone. The judge took a step forward, her body tense, but she made no sudden movements. She simply spoke, and her words sounded like a sentence. "The next time you decide to do that to someone you don't like, remember that you're not just confronting a person, you're facing fate, my destiny." The words echoed in his mind. He could say nothing. It wasn't just a warning, it was a fateful statement. Her eyes burned with rage, but there was clarity in her voice. Her silence became strength. Everything she felt was ready to be taken over by the force of the law. She was ready to change everything. The policeman, so confident of his position, felt weakness in his body. But he couldn't stop. He just froze because he realized that at no moment would his life ever be the same again. She continued to stare at him, her face impassive. But behind that face was a burning determination. This moment was only the beginning. As the video of the incident began to go viral online, nothing could have prevented the wave that hit the community. Surveillance cameras hidden in street corners captured every movement. The moment the teenager was abused, the moment the police officer used a taser with brutal ruthlessness. All of this has been made available to millions of viewers. And in that footage, in that injustice, was all the horror that was building up in people who were ready to snap. The video instantly went viral. People began to overload social media, each post becoming an angry cry against the police violence and racism that pervaded the system. Hashtags like "Justice for the Teen" and "Stop Police Brutality" became trends, racking up millions of responses. In every corner of the country, in every city, and in every home, people saw the video and tried to understand with outrage how this could happen. Those who had previously remained silent about racism in the police force were now unable to turn a blind eye. The image of a teenager on crutches falling to the ground from an electric shock became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. His painful spurts and despair were the moments that hit the heart. How could anyone be so cruel, so indifferent to pain and suffering? It was unbearable. Several days passed, and finally details began to emerge. Reports, interviews, statements from activists and human rights defenders. They all spoke of the same thing: the inevitable injustice associated with racism in the law enforcement system. The racist stereotypes used by the police became clearer than ever. A teenager was not just a person to them. He was a threat because he was black, because his skin was dark, and his movement down the street was perceived as a challenge. Officers who had a duty to protect were now becoming a symbol of contempt and inhumanity. Protests broke out on social media. Demonstrations were held across the country. People in various cities gathered in the streets holding placards demanding justice. Anger, like an avalanche, swept the world. And amidst all this storm, amidst all these protests, important and powerful words were spoken. For the public was now not just speaking out, it was making an accusation. They blamed not only the police, but also the system that maintained such order. They said that this incident was just part of a larger and systemic evil, that it did not end with one incident, but had been going on for years, for decades, and they demanded change, demanded that things like this never happen again. They demanded that the police be held accountable for what happened, and not just for the actions of one man, but for all those other actions that had gone unpunished in the past. The judge, despite her resilience and determination, now stood at the center of a tumultuous struggle. This was not only her personal challenge, it was a struggle for justice that transcended her personal experiences. The fear and anger of the crowd became her daily reality. People looked to her as the last pillar of this world. Her internal struggle, however, was no less fierce. She was already experiencing loss, the loss of hope that law and justice could prevail. She felt that she would be subjected to the harshest of pressures, that she would have to confront everything that stood in the way. This case had shaken up the world, and now not only her personal strength but her faith in the system was in question. She knew she couldn't make it this far without suffering great losses, without being slandered, without being accused of trying to hold back justice. And yet, despite this, she was ready to fight, ready to expose the forces that continued to ruin lives. The judge couldn't stop herself. She already knew that the consequences that would come would change her son's life, her own life, and the lives of those around her. But she couldn't give up. She couldn't silently watch as the system continued to destroy the truth. The world was changing. The judge entered the hall with a confident gait, but her heart was beating faster than ever. Everything she had once known about justice now seemed distant and vague. The laws she had relied on so much were inapplicable at this moment. She stood at the center of this battle. She was responsible for a decision that would change everything. Her son, an innocent teenager, had become the symbol of a huge problem that society continued to ignore. And now, here, in the face of the world, she had to make a decision that would bring her life down. She knew that not one word she said, not one move she made, would be without consequences. The look she exchanged with the officers was so hard that they couldn't help but notice. This was more than personal revenge. It was a restoration of justice. But what price would be paid for it? She couldn't say for sure, but she knew one thing. It would cost a lot. The courtroom was packed. Cameras, reporters, activists, and protesters who came to support the truth. The people on her side prayed for justice. Those who supported the police were waiting for a ruling that would affirm their belief that such incidents were just exceptions, that police power should remain untouchable. They didn't see the problem because they couldn't see the problem. They could not see that racism and violence were not random events, but a systemic error that needed to be corrected. She could not forget the day when her son lay on the ground like a lifeless doll and the officer standing over him laughed. That look he had thrown at her was full of contempt and confidence in his inviolability. That moment had imprinted itself on her mind, and now she had to overcome it. It wasn't just about punishing one policeman. She couldn't let this system continue as it was. She couldn't let another teenager end up on the floor with a taser in their chest, another body maimed because their skin was dark. It was unbearable. It was a cruel crime against all those who had once been victimized by prejudice. The hall was filled with a heavy silence as the judge rose to announce her decision. The storm in the streets, raging outside the court windows, seemed prophetic. There was tension in the eyes of everyone present. She looked at the accused, the police officers who now stood as if defenseless boys before her gaze. In their eyes, she saw the desperation growing with every word they said. With every moment, they tried to prove that everything was according to the law. But the judge had already seen what they were trying to hide. This was not just the case of one man. It was a diagnosis of the whole system. The words she spoke were a heavy blow. Police Officer Williams was found guilty of use of unnecessary force, violation of a citizen's rights, and abuse of his position. His actions resulted in mistreatment of a non-threatening person and psychological and physical injury to the victim. The court ruled that Officer Williams' actions were contrary to the basic principles of the law, and they carry consequences. He will be held accountable. The silence in the hall was stifling. The judge felt no satisfaction. She felt only emptiness because she realized the verdict had been handed down. But what would it change? What will it solve in a world where the same tragedies continue every day? Where every day people are faced with the fact that their lives are worth nothing in the eyes of those in power. The defendant stood motionless while his partner in the corner of the room clenched his fists. He knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a brutal battle that would continue until the system collapsed, until there would be no recovery. The judge felt her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was firm and ruthless. This is only the first step. There will be no final victory in this struggle until the foundations of our system are changed. Racism, violence, cruelty must disappear. The judge realized that for her son, for all those who face this horror, this decision would not solve all the problems. But it was a beginning, the beginning of a path that would lead to change. She turned to her son who was standing next to her. He was now free from these shackles, though true freedom for both of them was still a long way off. But in that moment, she knew one thing. As long as she lived, she would fight. Fight for every teenager, for every person whose rights had been trampled upon. And though the fight was long, she could no longer stop. 40 Minnie. What do you think about our history? Have you had experiences with racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and stories are very important to us. We value each of you and are grateful for your consideration. Please post in the comments how you perceive these experiences. To let us know you are listening to us all the way to the end, write the phrase, "I stand for justice." Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like if you liked it. We wish you a good day.